record. And there we go. Very good. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for showing up today. If I hit the right button, we are recording this session once again. It's called The Cross and the Crescent, Empire and Monotheism. I have to say from the outset that given the time period that we'll be looking at this morning, that the use of the term crescent as a reference or a symbol for Islam is a bit early. It's a misnomer for this lecture because the crescent wasn't used in Islam until the age of the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, much later. So something along the lines of the Middle Ages. And just to show you, here's a picture of the Crusaders and the Saracens or the Ottomans in the Middle Ages, and they have their respective symbols. But before we get to the origins of Islam as one of the three great Abrahamic religions, we got to back up a bit and talk about Rome, because the origin of Islam is very much a part of what was happening in the world and is a reflection on how the imperial cult of the Roman Empire developed once Constantine declared for Christianity. In many ways, after Muhammad, the caliphate that arises it takes its pattern from the imperial powers of the day, the Romans on the one side, particularly the Romans on the one side, and the Persians or Sassanids on the others. So the Arabs, as they begin to conquer the part of the world that they will eventually dominate, and early Islam will very much patterns itself off of these empires and learns from their mistakes, which is why they become successful, so successful in such a very short time. Julius Caesar, we go back before the time of Christ to the time of Julius Caesar. Caesar was the first person in Roman history to officially be deified. What does that mean, to be deified? To be recognized as a god. Now, this was done in Roman society through a vote by the Senate. And this was done after he had died. This is St. Patrick's Day. 2 days ago was the Ides of March, the day that Julius Caesar had been assassinated by the Senate because they feared that he had become too powerful and that he would declare himself a king. He never got a chance to declare himself a king, but nonetheless, at the time of the rise of his adopted son Octavian, the Roman Senate introduced this idea of divination or apotheosis, in which they recognize previous rulers or even family members as gods, as being a part of the civil religion of Rome. Now, this is not an unprecedented idea. Generals and heroes had, especially in the East, that is in the Greek East, were frequently and popularly recognized as gods. But this is the first time that the Empire of Rome begins to look at its own leaders and to systematize a process by which especially those who have passed on and who are considered heroes could be incorporated into the state religion. As I said, Octavian, his name, we know him better as Augustus. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, not in the sense that he was a young boy and was raised by Caesar, but adoption as far as the empire goes, or the later empire goes, was a way of naming your successor, and a way of showing who was going to inherit your mantle and your estate. So Octavian was that person, and he was allowed to carry in his time by the Senate the title Divi Filius, which means a son of a god. And of course, the god in this case was Julius Caesar. So the imperial cult of Rome develops based upon Eastern or Greek precedent. It is formulated and formalized during the principate of Augustus Caesar, the early years of the Roman Empire. And what this was about, it was identifying emperors and some of their family members as having divinely sanctioned authority to govern. The idea is that all authority comes from the realm of the divine, the realm of the gods, and those who are the appointed leaders or the strong men at this point in history, might makes right, they are identified as having that divine sanction, and thus on their way to divinity themselves. The Christians offered a different view of the world. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12, a familiar passage to many, says, "You know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, 'Let Jesus be cursed.' And no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit." Christians today don't necessarily understand the context in which Paul is speaking, but to say Jesus is Lord, or in Greek kurios, was tantamount to an exclamation or a proclamation against the state of Rome, to recognize Jesus as ruler, as opposed to Augustus or Tiberius, or whoever the Caesar is at the time, as kurios or Lord. That set up this competition, if you will, between the Caesars and Christ. I have to clarify, though, that in antiquity, the term Lord, or Greek is kurios here, as in the New Testament, was not necessarily a term that denoted godlike status. It was a courtesy title, and it was a courtesy title that was reserved for the ruling class. That said, it didn't always indicate divine status, but if applied to rulers, particularly kings, those who are responsible to uphold divine order in society, then it was very much not only a political term, but also a religious one as well. And the way this took form in imperial Rome was that those who were required to show their loyalty to the state, their veneration of the state religion, if you will, they needed to show this by burning incense before an image or statue of the current ruler, the current Caesar. That was an act of that was a political act, but it was also a religious one as well, because there is no separation, quote unquote, of church and state, or religion and state. Everything is pretty much intertwined. So in this way, the term Lord carried religious significance that amounted to the worship of living gods when applied to the emperors. Very few emperors actually declared themselves or claimed that they were living gods. A couple of them did, and sometimes the Senate went along with that. But when that emperor, like say Caligula or even Claudius, when they passed on into the next, when they passed away, the Senate quickly revoked that kind of honor. the term Lord also has a biblical usage. We already saw it in 1 Corinthians 12 with Paul's statement about Jesus as Lord. But that it actually goes back to the Old Testament and the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, called the Septuagint, which happened. I think that translation occurred probably in the 4th century before the Common Era, somewhere in there. But the Septuagint, when translating from Hebrew, there it is, 3rd century, so the 200s, used the term Lord, kurios, when it came to translating the name of God. We somewhat, as Christians, sort of flippantly talk about Yahweh. We'll pronounce the name of God as close as we can get to it anyway. But the Jews, it's still to this day, do not pronounce the divine name that was revealed to Moses. It's spelled YHWH because Hebrew does not, technically speaking, have vowels. It's called the Tetragrammaton. So every time in the text, when the Tetragrammaton or the name of God appears, and you're reading the Hebrew Bible in a synagogue, for instance, instead of pronouncing that name, the Jewish custom was to replace it with the word Adonai, which means, oddly enough, or coincidentally enough, it means Lord. It's the Hebrew term for Lord. Or sometimes there's a custom of also using the word Hashem, which means the name. But that was the precedent set prior to the Common Era. So when the Septuagint translated from the Hebrew to the Greek, rather than try to come up with a Greek version of the Tetragrammaton, the name was so holy you just didn't write it in a different language. They simply translated it kurios, Lord. And so for Paul to say Jesus is Lord, you have to think, okay, there's a Roman background to this. Jesus is the ruler, like Augustus claims to be, or whoever the emperor is at the time. But there's also a biblical background to this, because that's the substitute in Greek for the divine name Yahweh. Also, we have to talk in terms of in Roman society that there were actually two words that meant God. One, and they're both related etymologically. They stem from the same root. But there was an important distinction between them. The one word for God in Latin was Deus, and the other was Divus. And the important distinction is that a Deus was considered immortal. So Jupiter, if you will, or Hera, or Apollo, the Roman pantheon, they were dei, or each of them was a Deus. They never had a mortal existence. They were always immortal, having never experienced mortal existence. Where a Divus, well, that was different. A Divus was a divinity or a god who obtained that status by human agency. So someone born into this world as a human being can attain godhood or divinity through human achievement and by a vote from the Senate. It's the process called apotheosis. And how it worked is after an emperor died, he and his members of his family, those who are held worthy of the honor, could be elevated to a state deity by the Senate. It served both religious and political ends. Living emperors, then the emperor that was alive at the time or who'd taken on the mantle of emperor, then would associate themselves with well-regarded imperial divi. That's the plural for a divus. So it is that Augustus called himself the son of a god. On the other hand, this status could be taken away. Unpopular or unworthy predecessors could be excluded from the state's religion by a vote from the Senate as well. This put Christianity on a collision course with the Roman Empire. A Christian message was seen to parody the imperial prerogatives, and thus, as far as the officials were concerned, served to undermine the authority of the empire. Now, this didn't take on the full-blown persecutorial state versus religion thing right away. It took a while for the empire to actually notice that Christians were different than Jews. But when they did take notice, now the Jews had been given special dispensation all the way back in the time of Caesar, Julius Caesar, and his son Augustus. They were given special dispensation that they didn't have to participate in the imperial cult. As long, when they had their temple, as long as they promised to offer up sacrifices to their god for Caesar, that was fine. So the Jews were exempt for the most part from participating in the imperial cult. So as long as Christians were considered a sect of Judaism, they were pretty much exempt as well. But when the Jews started distancing themselves from Christians, and Christians no longer looked very much like Jews because they were mostly from Gentile stock, they were uncircumcised, and they didn't have a high regard, comparatively speaking, to the law of Moses, then the Roman Empire all of a sudden thought, this is a different religio. This is a different confession. This is a cult that we don't particularly see as legitimate. So they were no longer exempt from the imperial cult, and that's what got Christians in trouble periodically. It was not a full-blown persecution for 300 years. Sometimes people get this idea that there was this big hunt for Christians. Local leaders tended not to want to persecute Christians, but occasionally it happened. And they were kind of puzzled by this, because all a Christian would have to do, who was called in, was burn a little incense to Caesar, and they should be off the hook. But they many times failed to do this and ended up being persecuted in the arenas and the Colosseums. In conquering death, as far as Christians were concerned, in conquering death at the resurrection, Christ was seen as conquering all human authority. It's not unfair to say that Christians were challenging the imperial cult. They certainly were. There was a prevailing belief amongst Christians, early Christians, that Christ would return in their time and set up a kingdom in which he would ascend a throne and rule bodily, physically on earth. That was not a universal belief amongst Christians. Many Christians said, well, we need to look at this more, we would say, metaphorically or spiritually, as Christ is ruling now from the heavens. But there were a number of Christians, and that idea began to fade away over the centuries, so that really, even though it may exist today, it's not the prevailing view amongst Christians. But nonetheless, they saw Christ as a competing authority against Rome. It wasn't that they were calling for rebellion against Rome. They were very content to live peacefully amongst the Romans and in Roman society, but they didn't want to participate in the imperial cult. So that set up a rival kingship, a lordship, a kingdom, if you will. The Caesars were claiming to be divine, at least taking on divine prerogatives, using titles that were familiar to Christians, familiar to us today, like Lord, Savior, Son of God, and to assert these throughout the empire. The early Christian community used the same titles for Jesus Christ, refused to participate in the rituals of the imperial state. And here's this is from a sarcophagus, shows a woman burning incense to the image of an emperor. Christians refuse to do this. You can even see it in the New Testament, in the gospel tradition as set up by the gospel writer Luke. Will make a contrast between the power of Rome and the example of Jesus Christ. The familiar passage from Luke chapter 2, in those days, a decree went out from the emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. There's the world's view of power, the world's view of kingdom and lordship, and the Christian view towards the end of that passage. And she gave, that is Mary, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Incredible contrast that it becomes so familiar to us that we take it for granted today. The message of the cross offered a vision of the world that was in sharp contrast to the world of imperial Rome. And essentially you have competing ideas of kingdom and competing ideas of peace, the peace of Christ versus the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. We have periods of sporadic persecution throughout the first centuries of the church. It wasn't all the time. It wasn't even really the list of martyrs that the church traditionally has is small compared to the numbers of Christians that lived in these centuries. So we're not talking a great deal of martyrs, but it did indeed happen. And when it did happen, it was violent, it was frightening, and it was done to teach Christians a lesson, to make them fall in line. That all changed, though, towards the end of this time period, prior to the, if you will, the peace of the Constantinian shift, when Emperor Constantine will declare for Christianity. One of the emperors prior to that, a man by the name of Diocletian, had this sprawling empire that he thought he could not rule by himself. So he devised a system in which there would be more than one emperor, and actually 4 emperors, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. But Diocletian's reign from 244 to 311, well, those are his dates anyway, was considered the most universal and harshest of all the persecutions of Christians. Now, this is how he divided his empire. This is where we get the East-West divide of the Roman Empire. You have the West, and during the time of Diocletian, we have Maximian as his co-emperor, and Maximian has a junior emperor, Constantius I, who's the father of the future Constantine I. And in the East, you have Diocletian, who set up his capital in Nicomedia, and his junior emperor, Galerius. Now, it's funny because they took on these imperial titles. So a senior emperor was called an Augustus, and a junior emperor was merely a Caesar. This is called the rule of 4. Now, it seemed like a very efficient way to rule the empire. It turned out to be a very efficient way to cause civil war, and that's exactly what happened. But prior to that, we have the great persecution of the church in 303 to 311. And the cause of this was military service of Christians. Christians were suspect. Were they really loyal to Rome? Some of them were pacifists, so were they going to make good troops? And Galerius, the junior emperor to Diocletian, convinced Diocletian to expel Christians from the legions, because in the eyes of their commanders, they could not be trusted to fight. The officers, looking at their troops and realizing that they faced some great dangers on the frontier, didn't want to lose all these troops. So they attempted to force Christians to denounce their faith. Some of them did, many of them didn't. And that is the cause of the great persecution. Resulted in a number of executions, especially the army of the Danube, which was under Galerius. The army of the Danube was right on the frontier. At the time, barbarian tribes were, coming over, the Danube and settling in Roman territory. So this was probably the most important army at the time, and was under the command of Galerius. Galerius next convinced Diocletian to expel Christians from all positions of public trust. There were a number who were in positions of public trust by this time. In Diocletian's own household, his wife and his sister were both Christians, so they were forced to denounce their faith. Many Christians were tortured, and one of the things that local leaders commanded of Christians were to hand over the New Testament, hand over their sacred books. And oftentimes that satisfied a local ruler. Okay, they've done their duty, they've handed over their books, we'll let them go. But this caused a schism in the church in North Africa, because those who handed over the sacred scriptures to authorities were considered traitors. We get the word traitor from it. They were traitors to the faith. And to restore them to the faith became a controversy. Could they be restored to the faith, or were they permanently apostate? The hardline view was that if you did this act of handing over scriptures, if you became a traitor to the faith, then you denounced the faith and you could never return. That would be the hardline view. And then the view that would become the quote unquote Catholic view was after a period of penance, you could indeed be restored to the faith. The pressure got too much for Diocletian. He decided to go into retirement in 305. And so Galerius takes over as Augustus. And at this point, the rule of four, the tetrarchy, begins to unravel. And Galerius holds it together as much as he can, but when he dies, all of a sudden, not only do you have a divided empire by design, but now you have a divided empire in the guise of all of these competing Caesars and Augusti, who are all they're all trying to come under or bring the empire under their control, and they're all declaring, all the armies that they later declaring them to be Augusti or Caesars, and you have all these competing emperors, and thus you have this civil war. That leads us into Constantine. Constantius, his father, had died shortly after the time of Diocletian. So he would have been the senior emperor of the West, but upon his death, the troops of Constantine declare him to be an emperor. And he makes good on that claim. But on his way to secure that claim by taking care of his rival Maxentius down in Rome, knowing that he's going into battle and the battle of his life, he claims to see a vision in the heavens of a cross. Now, the accounts are not necessarily consistent here. Some say it was the Chi-Rho symbol that he saw in the heavens. Others say it was a cross. But the message was clear to Constantine. This was the sign of Christ, and in this sign, in hoc signo vincens, that is, in this sign, conquer. So he takes this as a symbol of God, the God of the Christians, showing favor upon him. and he orders his army to paint the Chi Rho symbol on their shields. Chi Rho are the two letters in Greek that begin the name of Christ. Thus, his army's like, what is this all about? Nonetheless, this is how he meets Maxentius. He will go, I'm sorry, my mother's phone is ringing. Constantine will beat his rival Maxentius at the fateful battle of Milvian Bridge on October 28th, 312. The battle is not necessarily won easily. They make a bridge, a flotilla. The Maxentius army sees an opportunity to attack Constantine on the other side. The bridge is booby-trapped, and Maxentius's forces are defeated by Constantine. Hold on for a second. So that happens in 312. Constantine will replace the Roman labarum with a Christianized form with the Chi Rho on it, no longer the eagle, and he will have his own image on the banner. In 313, right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he will get together with Licinius, another competing emperor, and they will have a treaty with each other called the Edict of Milan. And now what they will agree to is that Constantine will rule in the West, and Licinius will go over and take control of the empire in the East. And they will divide the empire between them. But the important thing about the Edict of Milan is that it officially brought an end to the persecution of Christians, because Constantine made Licinius agree that Christians could now have legal status throughout the empire. That means that Christians on both sides of the empire, both East and West, will look at Constantine as their hero, and Licinius is kind of a reluctant emperor who's just going along with it. So Licinius, even though he does take control of the East after another civil war, will always be held in suspicion by Christians, and he will always hold Christians suspect as being loyal to Constantine. Eventually, Constantine and Licinius will also fight each other for power over the entire Roman world. At the time of, here's a map that shows you around 300, right before the time of Constantine, in the dark shaded areas, the dark blue areas, shows where Christians, and they're spread throughout, and all the major cities had very large Christian populations. So it was only a matter of time before the empire had to deal with the Christian problem by recognizing it as a legitimate religion. And Constantine just went ahead and just made it his religion as well. Shortly after, in the period of Constantine, after he declares for Christ, Christianity will spread throughout even the rural areas of the empire, and there we have the beginnings of what we now term as Christendom. Constantine becomes sole emperor in the year 324 after he defeats Licinius. This brings in the era of the Constantinian shift, because Christianity becomes legal in 313. Constantine quickly becomes a patron of the church, favoring bishops, building churches, financing the building of churches, and very slowly begins the process of integrating imperial policy with the affairs of the church, which will come to fruition, particularly in the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea. He will also move his capital. Now he's the ruler of the entire Roman world. He's both East and West. He decides that the East has more promise, and he moves his capital to an eastern city on the Bosphorus called Byzantium. And that will be the beginnings of the Byzantine period of the Roman Empire, and the foundation of the city Constantinople, which is called Istanbul today. Now, why did he embrace Christianity? Well, he believed that he could unify the empire through the adoption of monotheism. And he did a pretty good job of it, and so did future emperors. But he had a problem. We already mentioned the schism in North Africa. It was called Donatism. The followers of Donatus took a hardline approach to traitors. They did not see that anyone who committed the act of handing over scriptures or who had burned incense to the emperor as having any reason to invite them back into the church, into the Christian fold. So they set up their own episcopate, a rival bishopric, and thus a rival church. And as soon as Constantine declared Christianity to be legal, as soon as he took over full control of the empire, the Christians came to him, the Catholic Christians came to him and said, well, we got to deal with this schism down here. So here he thought he was adopting a religion that could unify, and he found out that, well, maybe it wasn't as unified as he thought. He tried to deal with Donatism in a peaceful way. Eventually, the Roman emperors will have to put down Donatism by force. The other thing is that, he thought Christianity was unified in its faith when, with a united presence and a united faith and everyone believed the same thing. He found out very quickly that that wasn't the case. So he had to deal with divisions stemming from different beliefs about who Jesus was, because that was the pastime amongst Christians, was to argue over doctrine. But once Christianity had the favor, was shown favoritism by the Roman emperor, then these different factions tried to suppress ideas that they didn't want to continue. This comes to effect at the Council of Nicaea in 325, when the Arian problem will be addressed. We now, in the Episcopal Church anyway, and many other churches, Catholic Church, Orthodox churches, confess the Nicene Creed to this day. Arianism believed that the Son of God, Jesus, was not equal to God, but had been created before the foundation of the world, before he came in human flesh. Thus, he was distinct and subordinate to God. And Jesus was seen as being sent into the world as a prophet. Well, that sounds kind of like Islam in some ways. Jesus was Son of God still, but not in a co-equal sense, but in a divinized sense, if you will, very much like the Roman emperors were divinized. Constantinople, New Rome, just to show you what the world looked like under Constantine. The Roman world still had two capitals, one in Italy, Rome, and one in the east, Constantinople. There, just a close-up, you can see Istanbul, that's Constantinople today, right on the Bosphorus, between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. Very defensible position, being on a peninsula. They even had a large gold chain, large iron chain across the Golden Horn, which was a body of water that they would extend when they were being attacked, so they couldn't be surrounded by enemy ships. So it was a very defensible position. Just to show you that this picture here of Constantine with the spear, he's drawing the outline of where the new wall for Byzantium should go. So this becomes the city of Constantinople. Constantine, even though he declared for Christianity early in his reign, did not actually become a full Christian until the end of his life. He was baptized in the last year of his life, and this was because of the belief that, as an emperor, he had to do things that maybe would be unforgivable after baptism, like, kill his enemies. murder people in his own household who were trying to have him murdered. So he believed that if all these acts were done prior to his baptism, then his baptism could wash all of these acts away. That was a very common belief of the period, and so many people were baptized later in life. They were still considered Christian, but they were called catechumens. They were disciples. They were learners of the faith. And when they became baptized, of course, all the rules change, and they have to stop some of the things that they were allowed to do beforehand. Christianity becomes the only legal religion under a later emperor named Theodosius. He declared Nicene Christianity is the only legitimate religion, and the only one that was entitled to be called Catholic. And he also outlawed all pagan religions at that time. But what I want you to know before we go into the origins of Islam, with the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire and the Constantinian shift, is that Christianity has gone through a paradigm shift. While it was a persecuted sect, the paradigm was that of the suffering servant. Now the paradigm is that of the conquering Christ. So you have the image on the left there. It's a medieval image, but nonetheless, the image of a suffering servant, a persecuted religion, people who believed that their suffering was in part united to the suffering of Christ, and that their victory was to be found in resurrection. Now with Rome declaring for Christ, we have this idea that Christ has conquered all of the kingdoms of the world and now can rule with an iron fist. It's quite a paradigm shift, and one that has been part of the tension of Christianity ever since. We still have it in our own day. The emperor takes on a new role. The imperial cult has officially been abandoned, but all of the rites and all of the practices and all of the status distinctions that characterize that old pagan cult of emperors still were in force, although they were now Christianized, which meant that the emperors took on a new role. They were still divus. They were still, if you will, human beings who achieved some sort of divine status, not like God, not co-equal to God, but they were Christian divi. Constantine had successfully united and refounded the empire by divine dispensation under the banner of Christ, with Constantine as its first Christian imperial divus. This is a picture of Constantinople during the time of the later time of Justinian, the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, who built that wonderful church, Hagia Sophia, in Constantinople, which is now today it was a museum. The Muslims had turned it into a mosque. In the 20th century, it became a museum. Now it's being used as a mosque again. What happens after the time of Constantine is that the West generally begins to recede. All of those barbarian tribes that have been encroaching upon Roman territories and had settled in Roman territories began to declare themselves to be kingdoms, and they begin to, the West begins to fall into disintegration. Rome itself will fall in 476, but the Eastern Roman Empire remains until 1453, my friends, 1453, which is a long time. Part 2, I see what time it is here, but nonetheless, we will press on. The final prophet. And by the final prophet, I'm referring to the claim of Islam that Muhammad is the final prophet of God. God's final revelation of his word to the world came through Muhammad, which is now enshrined in the holy book of the Quran. The world of Muhammad, You see here on this map, this is the period under Justinian, who was able to reassert his authorities in some regions in the West, the old Western Empire, but nonetheless his power base is in the East. Next door to the Eastern Roman Empire, what scholars call the Byzantine Empire. By the way, the Eastern Romans never called themselves Byzantine; they were Romans. Nonetheless, the Roman Empire bordered the Persian Empire, and this was the power struggle of the ages. This is like, America and the old Soviet Union, or perhaps the U.S. and China today, competing superpowers, with the Romans always having the upper hand. Below the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire is the peninsula that we call Arabia. Saudi, most of it is Saudi Arabia today, and it looks like a patchwork of many many Arab tribes, and it certainly was at the time. The Romans had been at war with the Persians for many centuries. It wasn't a constant war. It was mostly skirmishes on the frontier, but occasionally it broke out into all-out war, with no side ever really gaining the upper hand. The Christian world at the time of Muhammad, you have the Christian world broken down into the official religion, Byzantine Orthodoxy, nicknamed the Melkites. The Melkites, Melkus is the Syrian word for king. That recognized, the Orthodoxy recognized by the king or the emperor, if you will. The Nestorians, which was a group that had been declared heretical at the Council of Ephesus, and they were strong in Persia and Syria. Now, Persia is a different empire, so many of the Nestorians had fled to Persia to seek the protection of the Shah, Persia or Iran, if you will, and they settled there. There's still a church, a Nestorian church called the Church of the East in that region. The Monophysites, an interesting group, they were declared heretical at the Council of Chalcedon about 20 years later. The same debate is going on about the nature of Christ. The Nestorians believed that there was no personal union of divine and human in Christ, that there was a man Jesus and there was a divine Christ that indwelt the man Jesus. So, if you will, two persons, not one. Where the Monophysites believed the very opposite, that the divinity, the word, the divine word, in uniting itself with human nature, was one nature after the union. That is a divine human hybrid nature, if you will. Not two natures, but one divine human nature. Both of these heresies, the one that divided the personhood of Christ and the one that obliterated the distinction between divine and human, they were both declared heresies in a series of councils, Council of Ephesus 431 and Council of Chalcedon in 451. And then, of course, throughout the region, you still have remnants of Gnostic sects. These were esoteric groups like the Manichaeans, who had interesting understandings of Christ as a divine teacher, not a human being, but someone who looked human. The Gnostic sects were varied in their beliefs. The Sassanids in Persia, the Sassanid is the dynasty that at the time of Muhammad that ruled Persia. Their religion was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was a monotheistic religion, still is, of sorts. They believed there were many demigods, but ultimately there was only one God, and every other demigod was mostly a manifestation of the one God. They were generally tolerant of local religions, of all those they subjugated. They had to be, because the Romans, they needed the alliance of conquered peoples or subjugated peoples to fight the Romans. And they were always suspicious of Christians because they viewed Christians as Byzantine sympathizers. But because of that, they welcomed the Nestorians, who were considered by the Byzantines to be heretics. They said, oh yeah, come over here, take up shop here. We don't know much about Muhammad from sources outside of Islamic sources. That causes a problem for historians. But essentially what we know of Muhammad comes from the Quran, very limited in what it tells us biographically about Muhammad. But more important in the history of Muhammad are the prophetic biographies, the Sirah. These were written by people, scholars, quite a few years after the time of Muhammad. And they read mostly like hagiographies or legendary accounts. This causes problems for historians because these are not exactly objective histories or biographies of the prophet. And then there's this other looser collection of biographical information called the Hadith. And these are collections of sayings of Muhammad. And occasionally the Islamic scholars have had to sort through the Hadith and determine which ones were genuine and which ones should be disregarded. And they debate that all of the time, even to this day. Which means that there's a dilemma. The biographical information that we have on Muhammad is 2 or more centuries later than the time of Muhammad. The exception there would be the Quran, but that's a very limited in its value in the history of Muhammad, because much of what is written in the Quran that concerns the Prophet Muhammad has to be interpreted. And who's it interpreted by? Well, it's interpreted by scholars that lived 2 centuries later. So it's a problem. It's a problem that Christianity has with the Gospels and Christ, but the Gospels are written much sooner, not centuries later, but decades after the time of Christ. We do know some things about the life of Muhammad. In brief, he was born around 570 in Mecca. He was from the Parish tribe, which was a trading tribe, a mercantile tribe based in Mecca. He had been orphaned at a very young age, and he was sent to be raised by his uncle. When his first uncle died, his second uncle, by the name of Abu Talib, took him in, and he became a trader, T-R-A-D-E-R, trader. That is someone who, he would accompany his uncle on these trade journeys to Syria, and he gained experience in commercial trade. At the time of Muhammad, you have the Byzantine Empire in purple there, you have the fuchsia colors, the Persians, and you have in Arabia, you have this patchwork of different tribes, a couple of kingdoms. Muhammad was technically born and raised in the Hijaz area, the green area there. Below that was the kingdom of Himyar, which is a very interesting kingdom in that there were periods in which there were Jewish kings in Himyar. It was a Jewish kingdom there. Now, Islamic sources will describe Arabia as entirely polytheistic, and that everyone was an idol worshiper. That's a bit of an overstatement. There were areas of idolatry, including the Kaaba. This is a sort of artist rendition of the early Kaaba in Mecca, which was supposed to have housed 360 tribal idols. Now, these holy places, like the Kaaba, which means cube, these were places where the Arab tribes, who were always fighting each other, put down their weapons and basically had festival together. They saw these places as too holy for warfare. And so they would bring their tribal idols to be housed in this Kaaba, this holy place. There were three goddesses in particular that were revered among all Arab tribes: Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. These were considered the daughters of Allah. That should tell you right away that it may be polytheistic, but it seems to be polytheistic in if you will, an Old Testament sense, that there's still this belief in a supreme God and who runs the pantheon of minor gods. And really, when you look at Arabia and this part of the world, it's a religious melting pot of different views of Christianity, different communities of Jews. You have the Persians who are Zoroastrian, and you have the Arabs that kind of mixed in there as well. Legend has it that when Muhammad was 12, he met a Nestorian Christian monk by the name of Bir Hira, who foretold that Muhammad would be a prophet. So the connection between early Islam and Christianity, so especially heretical, quote unquote, heretical Christianity like Nestorianism, is quite strong, even within Islamic tradition. The later Islamic sources will talk about Hanifs, and these they recognize. Hanifs are pre-Islamic adherents to monotheism. Before the advent of Islam, they believed that there were Arabs who worshipped one God, Hanifs. And this is confirmed by Christians of the period. In the 5th century, there was a Christian from Gaza, an Arabic-speaking Christian from Gaza who wrote a great history of the church. His name was Sazaman. And Sazaman, he talked about the Arabs, the Nabateans really, or the Saracens, as was one of his favorite terms for the Arabs. Arab means a wanderer or a nomad. It really isn't a ethnic, it will become an ethnic designator, but at the time it wasn't. So all of these tribes had different names, but he liked to call them Saracens. And he has a very interesting theory where the term Saracen actually comes from. He believes it comes from the name Sarah, because he believed that the tribes, the Arab tribes, were embarrassed to have been the progeny or the children of Hagar, who was merely a slave woman. So they were claiming to be the children of Sarah. It's a contrived, that's not where the word Saracen comes from, but that's where he believes it comes from. But it's very indicative of the conversations that were going on in the 5th century. This is 2 centuries before the time of Muhammad. He claimed that the Arabs were part of the Abrahamic family, claimed that they descended from Ishmael and Hagar, showing that these were ideas were common currency during the time before Muhammad. He's not the only one. There's a bishop in Antioch by the name of Theodoret who repeats many of these same ideas independently of Sazaman. Sazaman will also talk about holy sites like the tree of Mamre, which until recent times, I found a picture online, I should have put it on the slideshow, of the ancient tree of Mamre near Hebron in modern day Israel, which is still a holy site. And Theodoret and Sazaman will talk about how this is a holy site for not only for Jews and Christians, but also for pagans. And by pagan, they mean the Arabs, because they're the only ones that were living in the area. Muhammad will marry, his first wife is Khadijah. She is 40 years old. He marries her at the age of 25, and she is a woman of means. She's a widow. She has money, and it's a great marriage because Muhammad needs money. There are other legends of his pre-Islamic period. There is a legend that when he was 35, this is before he had received any visions from the angel Gabriel, that he settled a dispute in Mecca between tribes who were rebuilding the Kaaba. The Kaaba had been rebuilt many times over history, They make no bones about it. If it's falling apart, rebuild it. But there's a stone in the Kaaba, a meteorite, that had always been seen as a sacred idol of sorts. It's still in the Kaaba today. Now it's considered the stone that Abraham and Ishmael had used in the foundation as Abraham was building a house for Hagar. But they were fighting over, the various tribes building this Kaaba were fighting over who should have the honor of placing the black stone in the wall or in place in the Kaaba as it's being rebuilt. And Muhammad comes along and says, well, why don't we all do it? And every tribal leader can grab at the end of a large rug and will carry it to its place. And they did that. And as they carried it to its place, they all said, well, this is a good idea. It's such a good idea. Why don't you have the honor, Muhammad, of placing the stone yourself? And so that happened around the age of 35, according to legend. Around the age of 40, later in life, Muhammad would begin to seclude himself in a cave near Mecca on Mount Hira. And here he was following a tradition that Christians had set, monastic types in the desert. You had many monks who would seclude themselves in caves in order to battle Satan, if you will, to tame the flesh and to seek holiness this way. You also had those called the Stylites, who would, very popular movement, especially in Syria, who would live on top of pillars for upwards to 30 years, never come off the top of a pillar. And people would have to feed them by raising up food to them. And they became a tourist attraction, especially to Arabs who were fascinated with these Christian monastic types, and seeing them as holy men who've given up so much of the world. Well, Muhammad takes that example, if you will, and goes into a cave near Mecca to pray. And that's where, at the age of 40, he reports having been visited by the angel Gabriel. Again, another Christian connection. The angel Gabriel is the same angel who appeared to Mary and gave her the news of her pregnancy. Gabriel gives him his first revelation. He at first thinks that Gabriel is a jinn or a genie, if you will, in the way we in the West would term it, but a jinn or a demon. But eventually he will be convinced that no, this is not a jinn, this is an angel. He goes to his wife, and his wife counsels him to go seek the advice of her cousin, who happens to be a priest, a Christian priest from Syria, Syrian Nestorian priest. And her cousin confirms that he has seen the angel Gabriel, and encourages him to continue to go and seek the word of God from Gabriel, and to memorize it. This will become the basis of the Quran. Now, Islamic sources tell us that Muhammad was illiterate. So the Quran, these revelations had to be memorized, and they were memorized by his followers. They were eventually written down, and a couple of generations after the time of Muhammad, they will be compiled in an authorized version of the Quran. And these were given in Arabic. So the Quran technically can never be translated. I mean, it is translated, but once it's translated, it's no longer the Quran. Because if God spoke in Arabic, if Arabic was good enough for God, then that's the word of God in Arabic. His earlier followers, he begins to preach publicly in Mecca. Members of his own tribe do not receive him well, because they, of course, have control of the Kaaba, which is a main source of income for them, bringing all these pilgrims to Mecca to worship idols. And he's preaching one God and submission to this one God's will. But he does gain some followers. His wife, Khadijah, his cousin, a 10-year-old cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali will be one of the first four caliphs And interestingly enough, the Shia-Sunni divide will happen after the assassination of Ali. And his close friend Abu Bakr, who becomes the first of the caliphs after the time of Muhammad. As he gains followers, they begin to experience hostility, and eventually he will encourage many of his earliest followers to migrate across the Red Sea to Ethiopia. There's a kingdom there, the kingdom of the Axumites, which is a Christian kingdom, and one which is a competitor to the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Romans, because they're Monotheisite, and the Christian king there in Ethiopia claims to be a descendant of Solomon. If you will, there's the origins way back of Rastafarianism right there. So he convinces them to go to Axum. In 620, around that time, there will be the famous Isra and Miraj, his night journey, and the revelation of heavens. He'll go up to see the heavens, the Miraj. This is associated with the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the mosque that's right next door in the same precincts as the Dome of the Rock. The Hijra of 622, this marks, if you will, year one in the Muslim calendar. This is a time of an exodus, if you will, for Muhammad and his followers. A delegation from a city called Yathrib to the north. This is the city we know today as Medina. Medina is a shortened form. I don't know the whole name, but it means the city of the prophet. But Yathrib was divided. There were many tribal interests, and they invited Muhammad and his followers to migrate to their city because they saw Muhammad as being a wise man who could be an arbiter. The people of Yathrib were very familiar with monotheism, owing in part to a large Jewish community that lived there. So Muhammad was invited to be the arbiter of these tribes, and he quickly organizes the city of Yathrib or Medina into an ummah by issuing a constitution. An ummah is a community. This is the first Islamic community, an ummah. And what he envisioned in this constitution was a federation or alliance of all the 8 tribes of Medina and the Meccan immigrants who had come to them in their relationship with other communities, including the Jews, that were defined as a people of the book. So Muhammad did not see Jews or even Christians as necessarily a different religion. He saw them as fellow travelers and worshipers of the same God. And he defined them very charitably as people of the book, that is, people of the Old Testament, if you will, or the Old and the New Testament. This will lead to conflicts with Mecca. His old tribe does not like the fact that he has taken up residence elsewhere. It does not help matters that Muhammad has cut off the trade routes to Mecca by raiding caravans that were heading to Mecca. And there are a number of battles with Mecca from 622 to 630, shortly before the time of his death. It'll eventually mean that Mecca falls to the Medinans and to Muhammad in 630 of the Common Era. And so finally Mecca will come under the sway of Muhammad and his followers. The first thing that he does is that he removes the idols from the Kaaba and sets it up as a sacred site for his followers and the worship of the one God, Allah. Now, soon after Mecca submits to Muhammad, all of the other tribes and all of the other populated areas of Arabia see their opportunity to take Mecca over. And so they initiate the attacks upon Mecca. Muhammad and his followers respond and eventually subjugate the entire peninsula shortly before his death. He will die 2 years later in 632 of natural causes. The rise of the caliphate, Muhammad never puts in place any any successors, any mechanism for finding successors. So basically, this is done at first by the elders electing a successor. Caliph means successor to the prophets. The first caliphate is called the Rashidun Caliphate, and this will span the early years of Islam from 632 to 661. As I said, Caliph means successor. Rashidun means rightly guided. The four caliphs of the Rashidun Caliphate were those who knew Muhammad personally and had memorized the Quran and knew about his life. They were rightly guided, which tells you something about later caliphates. They're not rightly guided, and there's controversy over the next couple of caliphates. But nonetheless, the Rashidun, for Sunni Islam, this is the period, the golden age of Islam. The first four caliphs after Muhammad, Abu Bakr, his childhood friend, who reigned only 2 years, died of sickness. Next was Umar. He was assassinated by a Persian slave. Uthman came after him. He was assassinated by Egyptian rebels. And finally, Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, who was assassinated in the Umayyad coup, which would be the next caliphate. Ali's assassination will cause the split between the Shia and the Sunni that we know so well today. The Shia consider Ali the only, out of these four individuals, the only rightful successor to Muhammad. Now, Ali had conceded the caliphate to Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, but he was always a candidate for caliph, and he was always passed over, and he didn't make too many, he didn't make much of it. But in the end, when he was assassinated, his followers who would become the Shia sect of Islam and will recognize him as the only legitimate successor of Muhammad. The Rashidun, after having united the Arabian Peninsula, now had two neighbors to the north, the Sasanian Empire of the Persians and the Byzantine Empire of the Romans, the Eastern Romans. They will attack the Sasanian Empire first. It is the one that is the weakest and most disunified, and they will quickly take it over. Part three, the final section here, we have a few more minutes. We have to come up with reasons behind the success of the early Arab conquest and the rapid spread in Islam, because it is quite a remarkable thing, and scholars have been debating it for centuries and centuries and centuries. Muslims today see it as nothing less than miraculous, how Islam spread so quickly in its early years. But when you consider the shape of these two competing empires, the Byzantine and the Persians, the first reason is kind of obvious, that these empires had seen better days. They had been in decline, and they were no longer even fighting on their frontiers. They were getting other client states and kingdoms to fight for them. Their outposts on the frontiers were falling apart. The fortresses were in bad shape, poorly manned. And again, they were relying on others to fight their wars for them. So after decades of back and forth territorial gains and losses, both empires had exhausted their resources. They were under a great deal of internal disintegration as well. They had been affected in the 600s by a recent plague. The Sassanid rulers had lost the confidence of the Persian elites. The Sassanids, that was a dynasty, and there were other dynasties, competing dynasties, that were jockeying for taking over the Persian Empire. The Christian writers of the time, especially in Syria and Egypt, believed that the Arab raids were a judgment from God, because they saw that things in their world were not up to snuff. The Byzantines were also persecuting other Christians. There was the official orthodoxy, but they were putting down the heretic, those that they considered heretics, those who were opposed to the Chalcedonian Creed, especially in Syria and Egypt. So they weren't making friends in their own territories. They were making enemies. The second reason is that there was a military advantage that happened in early Islam the early Arab conquest when Christianized Arab tribes switched sides. A lot of people don't know that some of the Arab tribes to the north had actually been Christianized, and some of these tribes had fought on the side of either the Byzantines or the Sassanians. The two main tribes are the Ghassanids in the west and the Lakhmids in the east, and these tribes were often served in the regular or auxiliary troops of these empires. And now they switched sides. They started fighting against their former allies. They had the upper hand, and they saw that, this is the wind of change. If you can't beat them, join them. So they joined up with the Rashidun Caliphate to defeat these older empires that were falling apart anyway. Here's a map to show the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids. The Ghassanids are Monophysites. They're Monophysite Christian, so they're not even of the Byzantine Orthodoxy. So they have a reason to begin to fight for the other side. The Lakhmids are Nestorian, and the misstep with the Lakhmids was that the Sassanians had actually annexed their kingdom to their empire. So the Lakhmids were not happy with that. They were no longer an autonomous empire. So when the Arabs came north to take over the Persian Empire, the Lakhmids quickly joined up and defeated the Sassanids. Christian groups that were disaffected by the Byzantine Church, the Monophysites, the Nestorians, the Jacobites, the Copts in Egypt, and the various Gnostic sects. So the Byzantine Church, the orthodoxy of the empire, was not popular. Reason 3, the Arabs, their commanders gave generous terms to the inhabitants of conquered lands. This was not, go in, defeat, destroy, kill off populations. Usually the conquest started with a tribe, or with these Arab armies outside the gates or the villages, and saying, look, we're going to offer you terms of peace. You accept them, we'll let you go. If you don't, we'll come in. And that was a very successful way of conquering these lands. Those who surrendered peacefully were placed under the protection of the Arab armies. And those who went as far as to offer military service were exempted from paying tribute to the invading Arab armies. So that's a pretty good strategy to use. Reason number 4, the swiftness of the Arab armies. They were quick. They were nomads. They knew how to pack light and travel fast with little provision, and they were conditioned to the environment. And that raised fear, fanned the flames of fear throughout the region. These were crack troops. This was the shock and awe, if you will, of the early Middle Ages. These were armies that were well equipped and well able to advance very rapidly throughout the region. They were accustomed to nomadic existence, harsh environments. They were fast, well motivated, and now under the banner of Islam, they were highly motivated and highly zealous. They were united. Just to show you a series of maps. In 600, when Muhammad was a young man, the world looked like this. You have Persia on the right. You have Byzantium, the Romans on the left, or the West, if you will, and Arabia not united. 32 years later, you have a united Arabia at the death of Muhammad and the rise of the Caliphate. 30 years after that, you have the Persian Empire completely taken over, and much of the Eastern Roman Empire, the lands of Syria and Egypt, are now under the rule of the Arabs. And then about not even a century later, under the Umayyads, this would be the high water mark of early Islam. It will have taken control of all of North Africa, have crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and will stop at the right at the border of what we see as France now. The Franks will finally defeat, under Charles Martel, the father of Charlemagne, will defeat the Umayyads and stop their approach. And that's the way the world will look for a number of centuries after that. And a reason number 5, and I saved this one for last, the best for last, the power of a simple creed. And we cannot overemphasize or we can't exaggerate here. This is the true secret behind the early Arab conquest. This is a lesson they learned from the Byzantines. They learned from the Byzantines, the Eastern Romans, that monotheism had the power to unite diverse tribes and peoples under one banner, who would then fight under that banner for the propagation of a common creed. That's the positive lesson that was learned. But they also learned a negative one. And that was that theological arguments can all too easily fracture that creedal unity. The Muslim creed, the Shahada, if you will, is very simple. When you compare it to the Nicene Creed, you can see the simplicity, right? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And that's it. That's the creed. There are 6 articles of belief that go along with Islam, but they're very simple. The belief in Allah, that is the Arabic word for God. The belief in angels, very important, because that's how Muhammad received the word of God, through the angel Gabriel. Belief in divine books. The Quran supremely is the word of God, cannot be changed, cannot even technically be translated into other languages. The true Quran is in Arabic, but there's a reverence for the Old Testament and the New Testament in Islam, especially seen in the designation peoples of the book. Christians and Jews are considered peoples of the book. And much of their beliefs about Abraham, about the prophets, derive from especially the Old Testament. And much of their beliefs about Jesus derive from the Gospels. A belief in the prophets. Muhammad is the last of the prophets, but there's a series of prophets that include Jesus. Go all the way back to Adam, and of course Abraham, and a number of other prophets, all the way up to Jesus, who was the prophet who preceded Muhammad. And a belief in the day of judgment. This was very much an apocalyptic movement, believing that the end of the world, the apocalypse, was upon, it was imminent. And so in that sense, it was very much like Christianity, or early Christianity, if you will. And belief in God's predestination. God is absolute, controls all things. There is Islamic predestination borders on fatalism, if you will, or extreme determinism. I shouldn't say fatalism, but extreme determinism. God predestines all things. That leads to the question that comes out of the period from Christian scholars, who did not look at Islam as another religion. They saw it as a Christian heresy. John of Damascus, who was a secretary under the Umayyad rulers, Islamic rulers, saw Islam as a Christian heresy. not as a different religion at all. And that's kind of an odd designation. But when you consider that Muhammad was visited by Gabriel, same visited that angel that visited Mary, that the Quran venerates Mary as the Virgin Mother of Jesus, also affirming Mary's perpetual virginity, that is, that she remained a virgin throughout her life, and all of the teachings about Jesus in Islam that reflect a knowledge and interaction with all the doctrinal disputes that were happening at the time of Muhammad. So it's very natural, perhaps, for Christians who see Islam, at least the early form of Islam, to think of it in terms of just another Christian heresy. You look at the views of Islam for Jesus, they believe that Jesus was a Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, as Christians did. He was a miracle worker, prophet. He raised people from the dead. He was born of a virgin. Muslims even affirm some early Christian legends surrounding Jesus's childhood. There's a manuscript called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which records some of the things that Jesus did as a child, including making little sparrows out of clay and giving them life so that they'd fly away. Well, that's a tradition that is continued in Islam. That is a belief. That's a legend, early Christian legend that was taken up and adopted by the Islamic faith. They believe that Jesus ascended into heaven. They also believe that he'll return at the end of the age in glory. There's different ideas of how that's going to happen, but nonetheless, that's a early Christian belief that has been adopted as an Islamic belief. But here's the difference. Jesus was a human. He was not the Son of God in an ontological sense. If you will, the Islamic Jesus looks a lot like the Nestorian Jesus, except that there's no union. The Nestorians at least had a union of the divine and the human in Christ, and that the Christ indwelt the human Jesus. There's not that sense in Islam, but there is still the sense that that Jesus was a human being, and thus a prophet of God. There's also the belief common in Islam. It's not necessarily a dogma, and it's not taught in the Quran, that Jesus was never crucified. This was a view of an early Gnostic sect called the Basilidians. Basilides had taught that Jesus was never crucified, that when Simon the Cyrene was ordered to carry the cross of Jesus, that Simon was crucified instead of Jesus, and Jesus got away. So that was again a belief, an esoteric belief, and not one that was taken very seriously by Christians at the time. Not even historians believe that, but nonetheless, a view that you could see easily entered the Islamic belief system, or at least the legends behind Jesus. And there are some Muslims who believe that Simon was the one who was crucified instead of Jesus, and others who believe that it was Judas. But nonetheless, the idea that Jesus was actually crucified, it's considered a shameful way to die. God would not have let a prophet, a genuine prophet, die that way. So you can see that there are some commonalities and also some stark differences, but even those differences have a Christian origins of sort, and stem from the period in which these ideas were hotly debated, not so much in the mainstream, but in the fringes of the empire and in these regions like Arabia, which were a melting pot of ideas. The character of early Islam, that's a question. It certainly didn't look like Islam looks today, or even a generation or so after Muhammad. The early period of Islam under Muhammad and under the Rashidans looked more like a believers movement. And I mean that in a very general sense. Muhammad did not see himself as the founder of a new religion. He saw himself as a prophet in the long line of prophets sent by God to the children of Abraham. Early Islam self-consciously presented itself as a reform movement within the Abrahamic family of faith. And the ideal in early Islam that could never quite be realized, but nonetheless, it was the early ideal that you see even in the Quran, was that Islam was a way of making an alliance in a common cause with other peoples of the book. Initially, just the Jews and the Christians. Now, they had a problem because they went and they attacked the Persian Empire first, and they had all these Zoroastrians. And it was like, well, what do we do about them? They're not peoples of the book, but they were, in a sense, monotheists. So they came under the protection of the dhimmi laws as well, the laws of protected people as well. That problem will arise again as Islam begins to move east into India. And what do you do with the Hindus and the Buddhists? Well, that becomes a problem because are they protected peoples? And so the protected peoples definition of a protected people will expand beyond merely the Jews and the Christians. Disaffected Christians and even some Jewish communities fought alongside the Muslims. And we have to remember this. The Arab conquest, especially in North Africa, Egypt and North Africa and into Syria, oftentimes these areas, they happen successfully because the Christians and the Jews of these regions were tired of Byzantine rule and joined sides with the Muslim. And in fact, for most of Islamic history, these areas were effectively still Christian. They just had Islamic rulers. A majority of Syria and Egypt for a very long time remained Christian. In North Africa and Spain. Eventually attrition will have its way and they're no longer majority Christian regions. They're now majority Islamic, obviously, but there's still large Christian populations, even in places like Iraq and Iran still have a very healthy Christian population. Minority status, but nonetheless, and they're free to worship. This idea in the West that somehow Islam is just kills Christians and Jews, it's really unfair. It's extremely unfair and a gross misunderstanding. Even under Saddam Hussein, Christians enjoyed much freedom in Iraq and were able to worship, and the state sometimes even financed the building of churches. But that's not, we've demonized that, in our time and for good reason, Saddam Hussein was a dictator and he was a bad human being. But we've so demonized the Middle East, the Islamic Middle East, that we really can't see what the reality is on the ground. This leads to this idea of dhimmi status, a protected person. These are non-Muslims living under Islamic rule with legal protection. Dhimmis were allowed to practice their religion unhindered under certain restrictions and maintain a level of autonomy within their own communities. In the early period, many Jews and Christians served important positions within Islamic society. Now, dhimmis were often subjected to taxation. The dhimmi tax, I forget what it's actually called, but the taxes that were imposed upon dhimmis at first were seen as, okay, you don't have to provide military service, but it's going to cost you. We're going to tax you for that privilege. Later, it will become more oppressive, and it will make Christians and Jews think, well, maybe we should become Muslim just to avoid the taxes. Under the Umayyads, the next caliphate from 661 to 750, this is the period where Islam is beginning to take shape into what we know as Islam today, what we would call normative Islam. And for a very good reason. The Umayyads were usurpers. they had killed Ali, the last of the Rashiduns, the cousin of Muhammad. So they had to prove their submission to God. And so it's in the Umayyad period that we have the final version of the Quran, the standard version of the Quran. We have the Umayyads who are saying very clearly on their coins and on their monuments, Muhammad is God's prophet. It's interesting, the Rashidun period, the coins don't mention, the coins that were issued don't mention Muhammad. Basically, the coins will say things like, praise be to God, or praise be to Allah. Because there's a sense in early Islam that Allah unites peoples of the book, all monotheists, not just Muslims. Later on, of course, it will become very sectarian. Normative Islam becomes very sectarian, and the lines are drawn very distinctly between Christian, Jew, and Muslim. The Sunni Shia divide. If theological disagreement proved to be the undoing of Christian unity in the Byzantine Empire, the struggle to recognize and legitimize the successors of Muhammad would prove to be the undoing of Islamic unity, and that is the Achilles heel of Islam. This idea of successors. There hasn't been a caliphate, not a legitimate caliphate, since the Abbasids, after the Umayyads. Actually, the Fatimids. There were 5 recognized caliphates in Sunni Islam, and recently we've had the attempt by ISIS to form another caliphate, but that has not been generally recognized. So the divide is there, it's very real. So in my final slide, the final analysis, that monotheism empire, Islam being birthed in this concept of empire and monotheism, leads to a model that's still with us today of sorts. We have remnants of it even in our own society, even in this nationalization of Christian belief. And really it's the model that might makes right. I don't think it's a particularly helpful way of looking at things. I don't think it's the way, as a Christian, I don't see it as the way of Christ, but it is the legacy left over from this period. We see it with the Romans. We see it in the rise in the West of Christendom. We see it even in our own Anglican tradition with with Henry VIII and the foundations of the Church of England and the monarch as the head or the supreme governor of the Church of England. We see that these are legacies left over from this age of imperialism, where monotheism and government or state are united and integrated together. And it really explains modern day Islam today, and the relationship that we have as Christians, those of us who are Christians, with Islam today, and why these two religions are still very much at war with each other, ideologically at war with each other, if not actually at war with each other. That's my final slide. I've gone well beyond the time that we should have gone. I thank you for those who've stuck with me during this time. I'm going to stop my screen share at this point and stop